Hi guys, my name is Kristen. Welcome back to my channel. Kristen is Fully Booked. Today I'm going to be doing a wrap up for all of the books that I read in the second half of February. I read a bunch of romance books in the first half of the month, so you can check out the wrap up for there. I'll link it above. And in the second half of the month, I did try to rein it in a little bit back to my actual TBR list, and I was moderately successful. So without further ado, I will get started. The first DNF was Starless by Jacqueline Carey. This is sort of an accidental DNF. I do plan on finishing it in the future. This is a fantasy standalone following Kai, the main character, who is growing up in a warrior priesthood. Kai is being trained to become the shadow and sworn protector of Princess Zaria. It is set in what feels like Middle Eastern inspired country, and there is a very rich exploration of the culture and customs in both more of the harsh desert setting when Kai is young and training, as well as the luxurious palace setting when he goes to live with Princess Zaria. There are so many small conflicts and plot points throughout the book that it almost feels like the book has several different plots moving along, and I did really enjoy them as they were happening, but the main plot or the main conflict of the book doesn't really feel like it is a driving force or a problem related to the book at all until about 3/4 of the way through. And I ultimately just sort of, by this point, was starting to lose interest, and I got really distracted by all of those other romance novels, and by the time I got back to it, my library reservation had actually expired for this book. The next book that I didn't finish in February was Breath of Fire by Amanda Bouchette. This is another one that I sort of accidentally did not finish because my library reservation expired because I was distracted by other books. This is the second book in the Kingmaker Chronicles, which is a fantasy romance series following Kat, our main character, who has some special magical talents that make her the Kingmaker. Griffin is a warlord who recently overthrew the ruling magical family in his country and put his non-magical sister and family sort of on the throne. Griffin kidnaps Kat for her magical abilities, and that sort of sets up the main plot. This is a world that is heavily inspired by ancient Greece, and the Greek gods play a very significant role in both the plot and the magic system. I actually really liked the fantasy plot of the first book, and from what I've read of the second book, a lot, but the romance, not so much. The first book that I finished in the second half of February was Ash Princess by Laura Sebastian. This is the first book in a young adult fantasy series following the main character, Theo, whose mother, the queen, was killed when she was really, really young by a conquering kingdom. Her people have since been enslaved, and Theo is kept at the palace as a hostage, and whenever there is an uprising or any sort of dissent or hints of rebellion happening within the world from her people, she is taken out publicly and beaten in order to keep her people in line. This does have some standard young adult tropes like a rebellion, dead parents, the main character becoming very suddenly really, really good at everything or exactly what the rebellion needs from her, a love triangle, and some insta-love. I would say it is on the younger side of young adult, not in sort of the content, but more in that it feels like everything happens really quickly. For example, she has been captive, I think, for 10 years, and the rebellion has made no attempts to contact her or to get her out of the palace at all. But as soon as she internally decides she's going to join the rebellion, suddenly she has no problem getting in touch with the right people, and the issue of her getting out of the palace is not an issue at all. Overall, I really enjoyed reading this book, and I probably would have picked up the next book immediately, Lady Smoke, if it had been available at the library. The next book that I finished in the second half of February was The Girl in the Tower by Catherine Arden, which I read on Overdrive. This is the second book in the Winter Night trilogy, the first of which is The Bear and the Nightingale. This is a Russian-inspired historical fantasy that follows Vasya, who can not only see but also communicate with the house and forest spirits in a time when people are slowly starting to lose their connection and their faith in these spirits and focus their faith solely on Christianity. While the second book had a little bit less of the house and forest spirits, it had way more plot and a much stronger sense of purpose to the overall story. The animal companion horse, Solveig, also gets a lot more page time in this book. If you are a self-identifying horse girl, I would highly recommend this series. There is a situation in this book where Vasya starts to experience a little bit more freedom in her life, but she also then sees what she has been missing and what her life could have been if her circumstances were a little bit different. And so in this book, she really starts to sort of rage against the cage that is her gender in this time period. Vasya does not always do what you want her to do. There are so many times where I was yelling at the book, wanting her to get out or do something different, but she does always 100% do what her character would do, if that makes sense. If you enjoyed The Bear and the Nightingale but felt like it was missing something, that something is probably in this second book, and I would maybe consider giving it another shot. The next book that I finished finally was The Eye of the World by Robert Jordan, which I am borrowing physical copies from my friends. This is, of course, the first book in the epic fantasy series, The Wheel of Time. I struggled with the pacing a little bit in this book. It was very start-stop. It is sort of a traveling and chase setup in this first book where the group is traveling like across the realm, but they're being chased by some Trollocs and these magical bad guys, I think called half-men or something like that. At this point, I am not really in love with the three guy main characters. Rand is kind of bland. Perrin is just very quiet and doesn't really seem like a big player at this point. And honestly, I just straight up hate Matt. He's the worst. I really hate impulsive characters who do things and speak without thinking, and Matt is very much so that person. There were so many times when they would all be told, like, don't tell anyone where we're going, don't tell anyone what has been happening. And seconds later, Matt will be like, Trollocs, now let me tell you a story about Trollocs. And it was just so frustrating. I have heard that Robert Jordan really tries to depict these characters as young teenage boys in the first book so that you get to see the character growth over the course of the series. There were some really genuine teenage moments, a couple moments with Rand and Perrin when they were separated, where they each wished that the other one was there because that other one was so much better at talking to girls than they are. So that was really cute. I found the last 200 pages really picked up in intensity and drew me in and made me feel excited to pick up the next book. The next book that I finished was All the Stars and Teeth by Adeline Grace. This is a book that I DNF'd in January. I was originally listening to the audiobook on the app Scribd, and I was not connecting with the narration, and so I put it down and I got a copy on Overdrive of the ebook and finished that this month. I did just pick up where I left off, and that maybe has contributed to me not really overall enjoying the book. This follows Princess Amora in an island-based kingdom, so there is a very much so a sailing setting for this book. After a ceremony to prove her mastery over her family's soul magic goes horribly awry, she discovers that not everything is right within the kingdom, and so she sets off with a pirate named Bastion and her betrothed Ferric in order to solve all of the kingdom's problems. I just really didn't connect with Amora as a character. She is very materialistic and stuck up. She has a very high and mighty princess attitude throughout the majority of the book. She is also quite mean to Ferric. And while I get that it sucks to have to marry someone who's chosen for you, I feel like Amora would have been a more sympathetic character if she had tender friendship feelings to Ferric, when in actuality, she's just a straight up bitch to him all the time. It tries to be a little bit darker with some of the more gruesome aspects to Amora's soul magic, and with the inclusion of a mermaid that follows more of the siren type characterization, but ultimately it just wasn't for me, and I probably won't pick up the next book. The next book that I read was A Deadly Education by Naomi Novik. I actually bought an e-copy of this on Kobo. This was a spontaneous reread for me. I originally read this book when it came out last fall using Overdrive, and I was just talking about it with a lot of people recently, and it really made me want to reread the book. I actually have a lot to say about it, so I'm just going to do a brief description now, and I will be doing a full review on it. The way this book is usually described is sort of like Hogwarts, but with no teachers and where the school is actively trying to kill you. And that's actually a very accurate description of the book. The main character, Elle, is a magical girl in our world where the kids have to go to a school called scholomance to protect them from these things called mals, who are attracted to their sort of magical life force and would otherwise eat them. Elle, up to this point, has sort of been a bit of a loner with no friends, and at the beginning of the book, she sort of begrudgingly and accidentally befriends Orion, who is sort of the golden boy hero type in the school. This writing style is not going to be for everyone. It is very different from Uprooted and Spinning Silver if you've read other works by Naomi Novik. The book is essentially stream of consciousness from Elle's point of view and is almost entirely exposition and little anecdotes. Because of this, the plot is fairly slow, and the book is much more about the character of Elle and the world building within the scholomance. This book is not without its flaws. The author really tried to make it an extremely diverse and inclusive book, and she wasn't 100% successful in its execution. I won't go into the details here, but some people did have some problems with the book. Where I think she succeeds is a scathing critique on class structure and privilege. If you really like misfit characters, friendship, and world building, but don't mind a slower plot, then this book might be worth checking out. The next book that I finished was A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms by George R.R. Martin, which I listened to with the audiobook on the app Scribd. This is a collection of 3 prequel novellas for A Song of Ice and Fire series and take place about 100 years before the first book in the series, A Game of Thrones. I absolutely loved these. Follows our 2 main characters, Dunk and Egg. Dunk is a hedge knight who has self-styled himself as Sir Duncan the Tall, and his squire Egg, who is secretly Prince Aegon Targaryen, and therefore the great-grandfather of none other than the mother of dragons herself. This is a much more lighthearted story than A Song of Ice and Fire, but it is still set in the grim and dark world of Westeros and the Seven Kingdoms, and therefore it does still have some sad and very bittersweet moments as well. I read this with my fantasy book club, and honestly, we all raved about it and were sort of scraping the bottom of the barrel to find critiques for it. And finally, the last book that I read in February was my non-fantasy requirement for the month, which was Murder on the Orient Express by Agatha Christie, which I read using Overdrive. This is a murder detective story of the Hercule Poirot series. It is in fact number 10 in the series, I think, but I don't think you have to necessarily read them in the order. I certainly didn't, and it didn't affect the book at all. I mentioned in my TBR that I had seen the movie but didn't really remember the conclusion or who done it, but once characters started to become introduced, I did start to remember sort of the gist of the crime, but not the specific details. However, that did not take away from the overall enjoyment of the book. In fact, I was paying so much more attention to all of the specific clues and evidence, trying to see if I could put it together myself. I was not able to. It had such an interesting cast of characters, each with very distinct personalities, and it really kept me guessing the whole way through with a very satisfying reveal at the end. The movie makes everything so much more dramatic in a very Hollywood way that didn't feel true to the book. Everything in the book is unraveled very meticulously and slowly as you get like little bits and details and pieces along the way, and the movie is very different from that. Anyway, that is it for me today. Let me know what one of your favorite books from the month of February was. Have a great day. Bye, guys.